It was 1967. Chicago, one of the largest cities in America, was alive with motion and noise. Streets teemed with cars, sidewalks with pedestrians, neon signs flickered constantly, and the smell of fried food, coffee and tobacco permeated even the farthest corners of the city. But on the outskirts, in an old industrial district, stood an abandoned meat warehouse, long the subject of local rumor and legend. Its peeling walls, rusted gates, and darkened windows evoked both curiosity and unease. During summer evenings, homeless people and curious teenagers occasionally wandered inside, leaving behind empty bottles, rags, and scattered debris. No one could have imagined that inside this seemingly ordinary building lay a secret that could shake the city to its core and eventually involve federal authorities. That night, an anonymous tip reporting unusual activity inside the warehouse brought the police to the scene. Initially, they expected a routine incident, vandalism, trespassing, or metal theft. But upon their first inspection, it became immediately clear that something was different. Amid the dust, cobwebs, old wooden crates, and rusted metal containers, there were neatly arranged, sealed containers with labels. Each bore the name of a patient from a mental hospital that had been shut down several years earlier. The officers quickly realized this was no ordinary storage space. The containers were not just closed, they were hermetically sealed, perfectly aligned and meticulously labeled. Some bore codes and numbers, likely indicating age, gender, or an assumed date of death. Everything suggested a deliberately organized archive where human lives had been reduced to catalog entries. It was immediately evident that this was no random accumulation of old items. This was a carefully structured system, painstakingly maintained over the years. The first hours of the investigation were among the most tense in the careers of the officers. They photographed, recorded, and meticulously documented every detail, fully aware that the implications of their discovery could be enormous. The atmosphere in the warehouse was oppressive. Each step stirred dust that seemed to hang in the air, like a physical presence, carrying the weight of decades of secrecy. The investigators quickly understood that this warehouse could not exist in isolation. Someone had to be monitoring it. Someone had to know what was inside. Attempts to locate the hospital's records revealed that most had been destroyed or lost. Former staff who might have remembered the patients had either retired or passed away. Police understood that the warehouse represented the last tangible testimony of what had occurred behind the closed doors of the institution, hidden from public scrutiny. Yet the containers themselves were remarkably well preserved. Metal lids were tightly sealed, labels were precise, and there were no signs of careless handling. Every element testified to deliberate intent. In the following days, the horrifying truth slowly emerged. The containers held human remains, carefully arranged and labeled. This was not simply a storage area for bodies. It was a systematically organized archive documenting the fates of patients. Every detail was deliberate: gender, age, date, coded notations, as if someone intended to preserve evidence while simultaneously concealing the truth from the outside world. The atmosphere inside the warehouse pressed heavily on everyone present. Officers and investigators reported a palpable sense of dread. Each new discovery added to a growing feeling of horror and disbelief. The construction of the warehouse only amplified the sense of secrecy and dread. Thick metal doors, absence of windows, and a ventilation system designed to contain odors all indicated that the creators never intended anyone to discover its contents by accident. Every aspect suggested careful planning, designed to conceal the truth for decades. Further investigation revealed that the hospital had conducted experiments on its patients. These procedures were performed without consent and aimed to study physiological responses, psychological reactions, and other unknown factors. Those who disappeared were officially recorded as transferred or deceased, while their actual fates were hidden in secret locations such as this warehouse. This revelation uncovered a massive scandal, one in which officials, doctors, and staff colluded to hide the facts from the public. Investigators meticulously documented every detail: the warehouse layout, container placement, labels, codes, photographs of the remains, and all associated documentation. Each newly opened container confirmed that this was not an isolated case, but a systematic practice that had persisted for years. Opening the containers tested the psychological resilience of the staff. Many experienced shock, anxiety, and visceral revulsion at what they saw. The investigation soon expanded beyond Chicago. Federal authorities became involved, examining hospital, facilities, records, and other potential storage sites to determine the scale of the operation and identify those responsible. Yet this warehouse remained the key site where the tangible consequences of the experiments were most evident. The containers and their contents offered irrefutable proof of human cruelty and systemic negligence. Early reports about the discovery caused widespread shock. Residents struggled to comprehend that such horrors had occurred so close to them, hidden behind ordinary walls. The warehouse became a symbol of how far bureaucracy can go when oversight is absent and ethics are ignored. The story of the meat warehouse revealed horrors concealed beneath the facade of the medical system and served as a chilling reminder that human life could be reduced to an object of observation and experimentation. Over the following months, the investigation continued relentlessly. Every new document, photograph, and witness testimony further revealed the scale of the tragedy. Investigators understood that this was only the beginning. The warehouse had opened the door to a network of crimes and secrets hidden for decades. Every detail, every container, every label had been crafted with precision to preserve secrecy. As the weeks passed, investigators began to piece together the broader context of the warehouse and the closed mental hospital. Official records were scarce, deliberately incomplete, and often contradictory. What little documentation survived hinted at a long history of institutional secrecy and questionable practices. The hospital, which had operated for decades, claimed to provide care for patients deemed difficult or unmanageable, yet internal memos and sporadic reports suggested that many treatments were experimental and unregulated. Federal authorities dispatched specialized teams to examine not only the warehouse, but also the remnants of the hospital itself. The building had long been abandoned, but traces of its past remained. Old operating rooms were frozen in time. Rusted surgical tables, yellowed charts, and broken instruments scattered across dusty floors. Investigators found evidence that many procedures were performed without consent, often under the guise of therapeutic experiments. Former staff members who could be located were interviewed, though many refused to speak, citing fear, shame, or complicity. Inside the warehouse, the scale of the operation became increasingly apparent. The containers were arranged in meticulous rows, categorized by patient demographics and what appeared to be treatment or experiment types. Each container was carefully documented with handwritten notes, dates, and coded symbols. It was evident that whoever organized this system intended for it to be permanent, hidden from outsiders but accessible to those in the know. The cold, clinical precision of the archive contrasted horrifyingly with the human tragedy it contained. Forensic experts examined the remains, attempting to reconstruct not only identities, but also the circumstances of death and preservation. Some evidence suggested chemical treatments, extreme environmental exposure, or experimental procedures intended to test human endurance or psychological limits. The realization that these experiments had been conducted for years with little oversight sent shockwaves through the investigative teams. It was not merely an isolated crime. It was a systematic abuse of human lives, sanctioned implicitly or explicitly by institutional authority. Psychologists brought in to assist the investigation noted the profound impact on both survivors and investigators. Officers who had opened the containers reported nightmares, anxiety, and persistent fear. Witnesses and former staff who agreed to talk described a pervasive atmosphere of secrecy and fear within the hospital, where dissent was suppressed and patients were dehumanized. The warehouse had preserved this history, literally and figuratively, in its rows of containers. As more information emerged, it became clear that the hospital had a network of affiliated institutions and personnel. Transfers of patients were often recorded officially as routine, yet those same patients appeared in the warehouse records, indicating they had been part of secret experiments. Federal investigators cross-referenced hospital records, census data, and missing persons reports, uncovering dozens of individuals whose disappearances had gone unexplained. The warehouse, it seemed, was only the most visible part of a much larger and more sinister operation. Meanwhile, public reaction grew. News outlets began reporting on the warehouse and the hospital's practices, though details were censored to protect ongoing investigations. Families of missing patients were notified cautiously, and advocacy groups began demanding accountability. The revelation that a trusted medical institution had systematically abused and concealed the fates of its patients sparked national outrage. Congressional hearings were planned, and the hospital's former executives were subpoenaed. In parallel, investigative teams meticulously catalogued every container and its contents. High-resolution photographs, 3D scans, and written records were created to ensure that the evidence could be preserved for prosecution, research, and historical record. Experts debated the ethics of releasing images or findings to the public, balancing transparency against the risk of re-traumatizing families and survivors. The warehouse had become both a crime scene and a historical archive, a physical testament to decades of systemic abuse. As the investigation deepened, new questions arose. Who had been directly responsible for the experiments? Were federal or state authorities complicit, turning a blind eye to what was happening? How many more patients had been transferred into hidden facilities or warehouses without their families ever knowing? Investigators realized that the answers might never be fully uncovered, yet each document and container offered a fragment of truth. The warehouse, in its grim silence, forced society to confront the human cost of secrecy, bureaucratic indifference, and unchecked power. The psychological toll on the investigative teams was immense. Officers worked in rotating shifts to avoid burnout, yet many reported persistent anxiety, nightmares, and emotional numbness. Psychologists provided counseling, emphasizing the importance of processing trauma for those exposed to the scene. Despite these measures, the weight of the discovery lingered. Each container represented a life extinguished, a family left in uncertainty, and a moral failure of an entire system. As federal and local authorities continued their work, the warehouse became a focal point for historical study and ethical debate. Scholars examined the facility not only as a crime scene, but as a case study in medical ethics, institutional responsibility, and the consequences of secrecy. The human remains, labels, and documentation provided an unfiltered look at how an institution could manipulate, exploit, and ultimately erase lives under the guise of care. By the end of the second month of investigation, hundreds of containers had been examined, and dozens of cases of unreported or concealed patient deaths had been confirmed. Each revelation added weight to the growing national outrage. Lawmakers, journalists, and the public were forced to reckon with the dark legacy of a hospital system that had failed its patients in the most fundamental ways. The warehouse, in its stark silence, became both evidence and memorial, a place that demanded recognition of past injustices and a reminder of the vigilance required to prevent their recurrence. Even as investigators painstakingly processed every detail, the story of the warehouse was far from complete. Every container held the potential for new revelations, names, methods, and personal histories that could shed light on the scope of the abuse. It became evident that the investigation would continue for years, a painstaking effort to restore dignity to those whose lives had been exploited and hidden. The warehouse stood as a chilling monument to systemic failure, a tangible reminder of the human cost of secrecy, negligence, and moral indifference. The more investigators uncovered, the more complex the picture became. Connections between the hospital, private researchers, and other institutions suggested a coordinated network that had operated with near impunity. Each discovery prompted new lines of inquiry, expanding the scope of the investigation beyond the warehouse itself. The project evolved into a comprehensive effort to document every known instance of abuse, identify all responsible parties, and understand how such a network could exist unchecked for so long. Ultimately, Chapter 2 of the investigation cemented the warehouse's role as a central piece of evidence. It was no longer merely a storage site. It had become a focal point for understanding systemic abuse, institutional complicity, and the human cost of secrecy. The case would go down in history not only for its shocking content, but also for the lessons it offered about oversight, ethics, and the fragility of trust in public institutions. By the time investigators reached the third month of the operation, the scale of what had occurred became increasingly evident. Each container in the warehouse represented more than just a body. It was a record of a life erased, a sequence of experiments performed under the guise of care, and a testament to the systematic cruelty that had pervaded the closed mental hospital for decades. Analysts began to develop a detailed catalogue, mapping each container to patient files, known missing persons reports, and fragmented hospital records. The human remains revealed evidence of repeated experimental procedures. Forensic examinations indicated chemical exposure, prolonged isolation, and mechanical restraints. Some evidence suggested attempts to manipulate neurological responses, while other findings pointed to the use of early psychiatric drugs in unregulated doses. Each discovery was catalogued meticulously, both to preserve evidence for legal proceedings and to understand the historical patterns of abuse. The warehouse itself seemed to have been designed to endure, with robust shelving, climate-controlled areas, and airtight containers, everything intended to preserve the human remains and accompanying records for decades. Investigators also began interviewing surviving former staff members, though few were willing to speak. Those who did offered limited information, describing a pervasive culture of fear and secrecy within the hospital. Whistleblowers recalled strict hierarchies, intimidation, and the systematic suppression of dissent. Any questioning of procedures or requests for oversight were met with threats, transfers, or termination. This culture of silence had allowed abuse to continue unchecked for years. Federal agents noted that many of the patients represented in the warehouse had been officially listed as transferred or deceased, yet these records often did not match the actual events documented in the containers. Cross-referencing state death certificates, hospital discharge papers, and census records revealed discrepancies that suggested deliberate misreporting. Families had been kept in the dark, believing their loved ones had been relocated or had died naturally, while in reality they had become part of a covert program of experimentation. The psychological toll on investigators continued to mount. The repetitive exposure to the human remains, combined with the knowledge of the systematic cruelty, led many to report symptoms of trauma, insomnia, and anxiety. Psychologists were brought in to support the teams, but even they acknowledged the profound impact of confronting decades of deliberate human suffering. The warehouse became more than a crime scene. It was a place of collective emotional strain and moral reckoning. Experts in medical ethics and forensic science were consulted to analyze the procedures suggested by the remains. Some experiments appeared to be early tests of psychotropic drugs on unconsenting patients, while others involved sensory deprivation, extreme temperature exposure, and isolation experiments. Each finding reinforced the conclusion that the hospital had operated with virtually no oversight, guided more by the pursuit of experimental knowledge, or perhaps ambition and profit, than by concern for human welfare. Journalists and historians began taking notice as well. Though much of the material remained classified, summaries of the warehouse findings were leaked to the press, sparking public outrage. Families of the missing patients demanded accountability, and advocacy groups called for comprehensive investigations into the hospital and its network of affiliated institutions. The case quickly became a national story, with congressional hearings and legal inquiries initiated to examine both the events themselves and the systemic failures that allowed them to occur. As investigators catalogued the containers, they began to notice patterns. Certain patients were grouped by specific types of experiments, and documentation suggested longitudinal studies spanning years. The precision of labeling, record-keeping, and preservation indicated that someone with significant knowledge of both medical practice and archival management had been orchestrating the operation. The warehouse was not a temporary storage solution. It had been designed as a permanent archive of human experimentation, meant to survive long after the hospital had closed. In parallel, digital reconstruction of the hospital's records began. Analysts used surviving documents, cross-referenced with container labels and forensic reports, to recreate patient histories and the sequences of experimental procedures. These reconstructions highlighted the repeated nature of the abuse, showing that many patients underwent multiple cycles of experimentation over time. The combination of physical remains, written records, and forensic data created a chillingly complete picture of systematic human experimentation conducted under the guise of psychiatric treatment. Legal teams began preparing for potential prosecutions. Though many of those directly involved had passed away or were elderly, investigators sought to identify anyone with knowledge or complicity. Liability extended beyond the hospital staff to include regulatory agencies, medical boards, and government departments that had failed to enforce oversight. Each new document uncovered in the warehouse added weight to the case, but also revealed the staggering scale of negligence and willful concealment. Meanwhile, the warehouse continued to function as both a crime scene and a historical archive. High-resolution imaging, 3D scans, and secure storage of all materials ensured that the evidence would be preserved for legal, ethical, and historical purposes. Scholars studying medical ethics, forensic science, and institutional abuse analyzed the facility, noting that the meticulous preservation of human remains reflected a systematic mindset that had prioritized secrecy and documentation over human dignity. By the end of the third month, investigators had catalogued hundreds of containers and identified patterns indicating long-term experimentation. Connections between the warehouse, the hospital, and affiliated research entities suggested an organized network, possibly extending to other facilities across the state. Each revelation underscored the scale of the operation and its implications. Systemic abuse, deliberate misreporting of deaths, and widespread deception of families and the public. Despite the mounting evidence, questions remained. Who had orchestrated the warehouse operations? How many patients had been subjected to repeated experiments? Were government or state authorities complicit, turning a blind eye? Each container held clues, but the full extent of the program remained partially obscured by decades of secrecy. Investigators understood that while much could be uncovered, some truths might never be fully known. The psychological, ethical, and historical dimensions of the investigation were intertwined. The warehouse forced society to confront the consequences of unchecked authority, secrecy, and institutional neglect. Each container represented not only a victim, but also a lesson about the fragility of human rights when oversight fails. The investigators' work, painstaking and exhaustive, aimed to restore some measure of dignity to the lives erased, and to ensure that such abuses could never occur unnoticed again. As Chapter 3 concluded, the warehouse had transformed from a mere storage site into a focal point for understanding systemic abuse. It became a symbol of institutional failure, a repository of human suffering, and a testament to the necessity of vigilance, accountability, and ethical responsibility. Each container, each document, and each forensic finding contributed to a growing understanding of how deeply the consequences of secrecy could affect generations of human lives. By the fourth month of investigation, the scope and complexity of the warehouse operations had become almost overwhelming. Investigators had catalogued hundreds of containers, each meticulously labeled and containing evidence of systematic experimentation. Patterns emerged showing repeated procedures on the same patients over months or even years. The combination of human remains, coded notes, and surviving hospital documents revealed a horrifying picture. A carefully orchestrated program of human experimentation, maintained in secrecy and shielded from public oversight. The forensic teams focused on reconstructing the chronological sequence of the experiments. Analysis of chemical residues, tissue samples, and historical drug formulations indicated that patients had been subjected to a wide range of procedures, some of which were designed to test human endurance, pain thresholds, and neurological responses. Others involved sensory deprivation, extreme temperature exposure, and repeated cycles of isolation. The intent behind many of these experiments remained unclear, but the deliberate documentation suggested a scientific rationale, however unethical, that had guided the perpetrators. Interviews with former hospital staff provided limited but disturbing insights. Those who spoke described a culture of obedience and fear, where any questioning of authority was met with punishment or ostracism. Whistleblowers recalled supervisors instructing staff to falsify records, report patients as transferred or deceased, and conceal any evidence of the procedures being conducted. These accounts reinforced the conclusion that the abuses had been institutionalized and deliberate, not the result of isolated misconduct. Federal investigators expanded their search to related institutions, uncovering connections between the Yaqui Hospital and other research facilities. Transfers of patients, sometimes under the guise of rehabilitation or specialized care, appeared to funnel individuals into hidden programs. Many were never reported to families or government authorities. Cross-referencing patient lists with census data and death records revealed discrepancies, indicating that the operation extended far beyond the warehouse itself. It was part of a network that had been meticulously designed to conceal human experimentation. On a broad scale, the psychological impact on the investigative teams was severe. Officers working long shifts reported nightmares, anxiety, and emotional numbness. Exposure to the remains, combined with the deliberate cruelty revealed in documentation, created an environment of ongoing stress. Psychologists assigned to support. The team emphasized the importance of rotation and decompression, yet the emotional weight of the discoveries could not be fully mitigated. The warehouse had become not only a crime scene, but a space of collective trauma, where the past and present collided in tangible, visceral ways. In parallel, forensic analysts began identifying the remains with increasing precision. DNA testing, historical dental records, and cross-referencing with missing persons reports allowed investigators to establish identities for many of the victims. Each identification brought clarity to the scale of the operation, but also intensified the ethical imperative to ensure that families were informed and that justice, to the extent possible, was pursued. The warehouse was slowly transforming into a somber memorial, a repository of lives stolen under the guise of medical care. Investigators also began examining the infrastructure of the warehouse itself. The building's design was striking in its practicality and forethought. Climate-controlled sections preserved remains, airtight containers maintained integrity over decades, and a meticulous labeling system ensured that no record was lost or misfiled. The precision suggested that the operation had been conducted by someone with expertise in both archival management and medical research, further highlighting the deliberate and premeditated nature of the program. The public response grew as limited. Information was released under controlled conditions. Families of missing patients demanded explanations, while journalists and advocacy groups pressed for transparency. Congressional hearings were convened to investigate not only the hospital and warehouse, but also the broader regulatory failures that had allowed such abuses to occur. The story became a symbol of institutional failure, demonstrating the dangers of secrecy, unchecked authority, and bureaucratic indifference. The investigation also uncovered evidence that some of the procedures were part of early psychopharmacology experiments. Drugs administered to patients were unregulated and often repeated in varying doses, creating profound and sometimes lethal physiological and psychological effects. Combined with sensory deprivation and other forms of coercion, these treatments illustrated the complete lack of ethical oversight in the hospital. Researchers were documenting effects for years, yet accountability was systematically avoided. Legal teams worked to assess the potential for prosecution. Although many of the hospital's personnel had died or were elderly, the investigation sought to identify surviving individuals who may have been complicit. The inquiry extended to regulatory agencies, medical boards, and state departments that had failed to monitor or intervene. Each new piece of evidence added weight to the case, but also revealed the staggering complexity of systemic negligence and deliberate concealment. As documentation progressed, it became apparent that the warehouse was more than a storage site. It was a historical record of institutionalized abuse. Scholars studying ethics, psychiatry, and forensic science emphasized the importance of preserving the facility as a teaching tool and warning. Each container, label, and note told a story of human suffering and bureaucratic complicity. The warehouse provided a stark reminder of the consequences when oversight is absent and ethics are subordinated to secrecy and control. By the end of the fourth month, investigators had constructed a detailed map of the warehouse and the procedures carried out within it. Hundreds of victims had been identified or partially reconstructed through forensic analysis. Patterns emerged indicating long-term experimentation and systematic concealment. The connections between the hospital, affiliated research facilities, and the warehouse suggested an organized, networked operation designed to operate beyond scrutiny for decades. Despite the progress, many questions remained unanswered. Who had ultimate responsibility for orchestrating the experiments? How many patients had been transferred into secret facilities without their families ever knowing? Were higher-level authorities complicit in concealing these abuses? Each container, each document, each forensic finding offered fragments of truth, but the full extent of the operation remained partially obscured. The investigation's ethical and psychological implications were immense. The warehouse forced society to confront the human cost of institutional secrecy, bureaucratic negligence, and moral indifference. Each new revelation emphasized the fragility of human rights when oversight fails, while investigators grappled with the moral responsibility of bearing witness to decades of systematic abuse. Chapter 4 closed with the warehouse, firmly established as both a crime scene and a historical archive. It was no longer simply a storage facility. It was a repository of human suffering and a symbol of institutional failure. Every container, every label, and every document contributed to a growing understanding of how secrecy, authority, and complicity can combine to devastate lives and families. The work of investigators, while exhaustive and painstaking, underscored the critical need for accountability, ethical vigilance, and remembrance of those whose lives had been erased. As the investigation entered its fifth and final chapter, the sheer magnitude of the hospital's secret operations and the warehouse's role became undeniable. By this point, investigators had catalogued nearly every container, analyzed hundreds of forensic samples, and reconstructed the lives of many victims. The cumulative weight of evidence painted a horrifying portrait of systematic abuse, institutional negligence, and human cruelty executed over decades under the guise of medical care. The legal and ethical dimensions of the case became increasingly complex. While many of the hospital staff and researchers responsible had long since died or retired, investigators were determined to identify those who might still be held accountable. Federal authorities examined connections between hospital administrators, research personnel, and regulatory agencies, uncovering evidence of deliberate falsification of patient records, concealment of deaths, and coordination to evade oversight. Each document, each coded note, each container became a piece in the puzzle of a sprawling conspiracy of neglect and exploitation. Meanwhile, forensic specialists continued to analyze the physical evidence. Chemical residues, tissue samples, and historical documentation revealed patterns of experimentation that were both methodical and cruel. Patients had been subjected to repeated pharmacological trials, sensory deprivation, isolation experiments, and extreme environmental stresses. The warehouse's meticulous labeling system allowed investigators to trace individual histories, revealing that many individuals had endured multiple cycles of experimentation. Each discovery reinforced the calculated nature of the program, exposing a level of premeditation that was almost unimaginable. The emotional toll on investigators and support staff intensified. Exposure to human remains, detailed records of abuse, and the systematic nature of the cruelty led to chronic stress, nightmares, and psychological strain. Psychologists recommended strict rotation schedules, debriefings, and counseling, but even with these measures, the sheer scale of the atrocities left a lasting impact. Officers often described feeling a profound sense of responsibility to bear witness and ensure that the victims' stories were not forgotten. Public interest in the investigation reached its peak during the fifth month. Media coverage, congressional hearings, and advocacy efforts brought national attention to the scandal. Families of missing patients, long denied closure, received notifications of their relatives' fates. Advocacy groups called for sweeping reforms in hospital oversight, mental health regulations, and federal accountability measures. The warehouse became a symbol of systemic failure, demonstrating how secrecy, bureaucracy, and a lack of ethical oversight could combine to devastating effect. Historians and ethicists were invited to analyze the evidence, emphasizing the educational value of the warehouse. They noted that the facility, its containers, and the meticulously preserved records offered a unique, if horrifying, window into a period when medical experimentation was conducted without consent and with minimal oversight. The warehouse provided lessons on the importance of ethical vigilance, institutional accountability, and the protection of human rights. As the investigation drew toward closure, investigators began compiling comprehensive reports, consolidating forensic findings, historical documentation, and survivor testimonies. These reports were intended not only for legal proceedings, but also for historical preservation. Each container, note, and record became part of an archive that could educate future generations, ensuring that the systemic abuses that occurred would not be forgotten. Investigators also uncovered previously unknown connections between the hospital and broader medical research initiatives. Some experiments had been conducted in coordination with private research organizations, sometimes with funding from external agencies. While much of this information remained incomplete, the evidence suggested a network of complicity that extended well beyond the hospital walls. The warehouse, in this context, was both a physical repository of abuse and a symbolic center of a much larger ethical failure. Efforts to identify all victims continued. Using DNA analysis, cross-referenced historical records, and forensic anthropology, investigators were able to reconstruct a significant number of individual life stories. Each identification was both a confirmation of tragedy and a step toward restoring dignity to those who had been erased. Families were offered counseling and support, helping them process the emotional weight of the revelations. The warehouse had transformed from a crime scene into a somber memorial, documenting human suffering while simultaneously providing a form of closure. As the final containers were examined, investigators reflected on the broader implications of their work. The systematic nature of the hospital's abuse and the meticulous preservation of evidence within the warehouse highlighted the necessity of robust oversight in medical and research institutions. It also emphasized the moral responsibility of individuals to question authority and intervene when human rights are at risk. The warehouse had become both a warning and a record, a physical manifestation of decades of institutional failure and human endurance. The legal consequences of the investigation continued to unfold. While many perpetrators were deceased, evidence was used to prosecute surviving staff where possible, and significant reforms were implemented in hospital oversight and mental health policy. Federal agencies reviewed regulatory failures, and guidelines for ethical experimentation and patient care were reinforced. The warehouse's contents served as incontrovertible evidence, making clear the catastrophic human cost of negligence, secrecy, and moral compromise. In the end, the warehouse stood as a chilling testament to the consequences of unchecked authority. Each container, note, and preserved record represented a life lost, a family deceived, and a system that had failed to protect its most vulnerable. The investigation, exhaustive and painstaking, had unveiled decades of hidden abuses, restoring some measure of truth and accountability. The final chapter of the warehouse story was not merely about crime or punishment. It was about remembrance, ethical reflection, and the imperative to prevent such horrors from ever occurring again. The story of the warehouse became a historical touchstone, a symbol of both human cruelty and the resilience of those who sought truth. Its documentation continues to serve as a reminder that transparency, vigilance, and ethical responsibility are essential in every institution. Through the meticulous work of investigators, scholars, and advocates, the warehouse, once a secret repository of human suffering, has been transformed into a monument to accountability and human dignity, a somber warning for future generations. By the conclusion of the investigation, The warehouse had fulfilled its unintended role as a testament to history. It had revealed the depths of systemic abuse, highlighted failures in oversight, and ensured that the stories of those who had suffered would never be erased. In its silence, it spoke volumes about cruelty, about resilience, and about the unyielding necessity of ethical responsibility in the care of the vulnerable.